Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asuk b'divrei Torah. V'arivna Adonai Eloheinu divrei Toratcha b'finu v'yimcha beit Yisrael. V'niyeh anachnu v'tzeitzeinu v'tzeitzeimcha beit Yisrael kulanu yodei shemecha v'limdei Toratech l'shma. Baruch atah Adonai l'mei Torah l'mo Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher b'cha banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten Torah.
Amen.
Right, so guys, we're on 19A3. And we're just doing a bit of review quickly. So Rav Yirmiyah inquired of Rav Zera, if the animal was walking in the public domain and the animal kicked and she propelled pebbles into a utensil and damaged it, what is the law? Do we compare it to Keren and therefore say that the animal's owner is liable? Or perhaps do we say that it's a derivative of regal since it is normal behavior and she, the owner, is free from liability? So what we're actually saying here is as follows. If you want to say that the animal kicked, and that's why the pebble went up, you could say that the animal is liable in the public domain under the category of Keren, because there is liability in the public domain. Or you could say if it is Soros, then there's no liability in the public domain for half payment damages, only in the private domain, because there's this law from Moshe of Har Sinai. So Rav Zera basically replied to Rav Yirmiyah. And Yirmiyah, he said to him, look, it's more reasonable to say that it's a derivative of regal. Why? The animal kicking up stones while it's walking is not unusual for the animal at all. It's the way an animal normally moves. And because of this law of Moshe of Har Sinai, that you're not obligated for tzoros in the public domain, this is why we learn also it's a subcategory of regal. And so it's more likely based on the behavior and intent of the animal. So fine. Rav Yirmiyah has another question for Rav Zera. He says, look, if the animal propelled pebbles in the public domain and then damaged a utensil in the private domain, what is the law? So Rav Zera said that there's no liability for the initial movement here. What does he mean here? In the public domain. So how can there be liability there for the subsequent coming to rest of the damage? So this is a logic that Gavin had the other day that I also had. That Gavin, did you and I both agreed with the logic, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Okay, and the logic was very simply as follows. So basically, Do we follow the initial propulsion of tzoros and consider it a case of regal in the public domain, or perhaps we follow the actual breaking of the utensil and thus consider it a case of regal on the premises of the damaged party? So in other words, Rav Zera already established that one is not liable for tzoros in the public domain. That we know. So he reasons further that if the initial propulsion of the pebbles takes place in a area of non-liability, such as the public domain, you can't be held liable for damages that this propulsion eventually causes in a place of liability, which is the damaged party's yacht. Okay? So by logic, it makes sense. But then Yirmiyah brings a brisa to Rav Zera. Okay? If an animal was walking on the road and she propelled pebbles into a utensil, breaking it, whether in a public domain or in a private domain, her owner is liable to pay for the damage. So then Rav Yirmiyah is asked, does it not mean that the owner is liable if she propelled pebbles in the public domain and damaged the utensil even in the public domain? So why does Rav Yirmiyah say this? Because it says, listen, you're liable in both domains, private domain or public domain. So therefore, Yirmiyah is saying, listen, if the pebbles did damage in the case of tzoros in the public domain, it would seem that you're liable. Isn't that how you would read it? So Rav Zera says to him, no, the brisa means that the animal propelled pebbles in the public domain and thereby damaged the utensil in the private domain. Okay. So then obviously Rav Yirmiyah asked, but you yourself said in your second ruling, if there's no liability for initial movement here, can there be liability there for the subsequent coming to rest? Okay, so this is clearly a disproof against Rav Zera's initial theory. So Rav Zera says to Rav Yirmiyah, I retract that second ruling. In other words, he comes clean and he says, look, I'm forced to concede that the brisa indicates at the very least that one is liable for tzoros that was propelled in the public domain and broke utensils in the damaged party's yard. But he said, my argument that we must follow the initial propulsion of tzoros is disproven. He says, I still maintain, however, that tzoros is a tall divergent and one is not liable for them in the public domain if the utensils was broken there. So he's saying, listen, I accept the brisa that where if the damage landed in the private domain, there is liability. But as far as the public domain is concerned, there's no liability. What we're talking about here is a case where the damage was caused in the public domain initially, the propulsion, and damaged in the private domain. So then you can say, even if the initial propulsion was in the place of non-liability, when it landed up in the place of liability, where it did actual damage, that's where you're responsible. But it in no ways makes you responsible in the public domain. So
can I just ask something quickly, Damon? Sorry, I don't normally like to interrupt. I think it's important. Why is the private domain? The private domain shouldn't put their private domain so close to the public domain because horses can always kick up. So isn't it their own responsibility if they put it too close?
So it's Gavin's asking a very, very good question. So one of the things to consider, there's a few points here. The one thing to consider is that how roadworks used to work in those days, it wasn't exactly the municipality with grids and electricity grids and sewerage grids. Cities or towns grew organically. So what happened is generally, if you have a look, Johannesburg is rare because it's only when we started mining or at Kimberley or anything where there are natural resources, that's where communities usually develop. So what happens in most of your towns is that they were developed because of natural resources like water, estuaries, etc. So therefore, there was a lot of people that resided there and worked there. So it wasn't as organized as you can imagine. I mean, you saw, for example, in most of the Western movies you've seen, or even in some of the duffs that we learned, is there weren't sewerage systems. So people threw out their sewerage in the public domain. It wasn't exactly what you call very well organized, etc. And people didn't want to travel huge distances from where they lived. I mean, even now, if you have a look, you've got a suburb like Glen Hazel, and you've got Orange Grove and Linksfield and Sydenham, etc. And then you've got Louis Botha Avenue, and you've got the M1. The highways and the arterial roads and the main roads are not far away from the suburbs. You have to somehow get to the suburbs from the main arterial roads. Anyway, what we're saying here is that there's often a case that we have in Sydenham where somebody is traveling on a public road and they end up losing control of their car and bashing through a wall in somebody's private house. It happens. It does happen. But the walkway has to be a place of non-liability because the reality is there has to be public thoroughfare and traffic. So unfortunately, that is the case. Is it a good idea to live on a golf course? No, you're going to have balls flying through your window. Is it a good idea to live in a place where it's like a very crime-ridden area by a main road or where there are a lot of car accidents? Not a great idea. I mean, honestly, that's where highways developed. If you look at the speed at which one travels on the N3, the R22, the M1, and roads like that, those roads where a lot of lethal accidents happen are away, exactly as Gavin said, from the private domain. But that takes a lot of technology, engineering, infrastructure, etc. And that also occurs because there's huge degrees of population. But in most areas, your public domain had to be close to shops and amenities and grocery stores, as well as medical areas. So they were pretty closely knit. The only thing that they could do in the public domain is pretty much guarantee that there wouldn't be crossing into privately owned homes. That's all I'm saying. Does that make sense, Gav?
No, 100%. Yeah. No.
All right.
Good answer. Thank you. Good answer. Yeah.
So no, because I think Gavin's question is right, and it's something that I've been thinking about lately. All right. So so obviously after retracting that second statement, just so okay, let me just get back on track. Sorry, Gav.
No problem.
So then what we say is Rav Yirmiyah presents another challenge. She said, look, there's another Tanaic source. It states actually in our particular Mishnah, if an animal stepped on a utensil and broke it, and a shard from the broken utensil fell on another utensil, right, and broke it, then for the first utensil he pays full damages, and for the latter utensil he pays half the damage. And the Brisa taught concerning this clause of the Mishnah. When are these things said? In the damaged party's domain. But in the public domain, then for the first vessel she is not liable, and for the latter utensil she is liable. So this is what it's saying, is that in the case where an animal with its hoof stood on an object, guys, that is a case of what? When an animal stands on of rego. Exactly.
Rego, yeah.
It's rego. It's the normal case of walking and stands on a utensil, smashes it. So it says that you're liable for full damage in the damaged party's domain, and then for a shard that goes off and damages from that smashed vessel the trajectory of that and hits a second vessel, you're liable for half payment damages because that's sorrows. Okay. And it says, but in the public domain, for the first utensil, you're not liable. Why? Because you're not liable for rego in the public domain. And then for the latter, in other words, the shard that goes off, you are liable. So there's a confusion here. I thought we learned that you're not liable for tzoros in the public domain because it is guys, it's a derivative of rego. So then what Rav Zaira wants, what Rav Yirmiyah wants to ask is, Rav Zaira, does it not mean that she propelled the shard in the public domain by stepping there in the first utensil and thereby damaged the second utensil, which was also in the public domain? So basically, Yirmiyah wants to get clarity from Rav Zaira. So Rav Zaira replies, no. The Brisa means that she propelled, by stepping on the first utensil, a shard in the public domain and thereby damaged the utensil in the private domain. Okay? And therefore, you obviously owe the half payment damages. So Rav Yirmiyah asked, but you said yourself in your second ruling, if there's no liability for the initial movement here, how can there be liability there for the subsequent coming to rest? So Rav Zaira replies, I retract that second ruling. So what it's doing here in the Gemara is it's actually mentioned different cases where Rav Yirmiyah is basically finding out for sure that any damage caused in the public domain, if it has a consequence in the private domain, that you're liable. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the first state, so this is the second case that's brought. Now, Yirmiyah brings a challenge to Rav Zaira from yet a third source. And by the way, it is Rabbi Yirmiyah. It's just sometimes it's a tongue twister. So when I say Yirmiyah, it's not out of disrespect. It's that I feel that my tongue's getting tight. Okay? So the question from the third source is it so that one is not liable for tzoros in the public domain? Okay? And basically, we on 19b1. It says, Rav Yochanan said, because it's bringing the source, the law of half damages is not divergent. Guys, what does divergent mean? Let's see if you're both on track.
Divergent is
I remember you telling
opposite.
us.
Okay, if I use the word divergent, there was a movie for teenagers on Divergent.
It's when two things cross or something.
Okay,
opposite.
so yes, that's exactly it. So if I come to a area and I diverge, I can either choose the left path or I can choose the right path. In that particular case, the road diverts. If you think of the word, Kevin, you still there? If I think of saying, listen, I'm going to divert from my route, It means like if I was going to go to Wanderers Stadium and I get a call that I've got to go back to the office, I've diverted my route from where I was going to go to where I have to go. So a divergent means they're going to two separate arenas.
Different directions.
Okay? So what we make directions, yeah. So Rav Yochanan said the law of half damages is not divergent. It doesn't change in the private domain nor in the public domain. Okay. In other words, it's the same in both domains. So then Rav Yirmiyah says, does he not mean to say that the law of Toros applies even if the animal propelled pebbles in the public domain and thereby damaged a utensil in the public domain? Okay. Kev, I'm hearing myself in the background. Did you change your setting? No problem. Okay. All right. So we're saying again, Rav Yirmiyah says, does Rav Yochanan not mean that the law of Toros applies both in the public domain as well as if he damaged the utensil in the public domain? Okay. So Rav Zaira is saying no. Rav Yochanan means to teach that one is liable for Toros even if the animal propelled pebbles in the public domain and thereby damaged the utensil in the private domain. So what he's saying is here, you're not liable for Toros in the public domain and the private domain. So when it says it's not divergent, you would initially think Rav Yochanan was saying, listen, both in the private domain and the public domain, it's the same. So you're either liable in both areas or you're not liable in either area. So we just learned from Rav Zaira that you're liable in the private domain. So then Rav Yirmiyah says, are you not then liable in the public domain? So Rav Zaira says, no. We're only talking about a case where you damaged in the public domain and it had an effect in the private domain. In that case, the law is not divergent, meaning because you don't suddenly lose liability in the public domain. And therefore, we have that case, Yirmiyahu, who asks, but you yourself said in your second ruling, if there's no liability for initial movement here, can there be liability there for the subsequent coming to rest? And Rav Zaira says to him, I retract that second ruling. So it's giving three examples of the same thing. Yeah. But Rav Zaira is also saying, listen, if you prefer, you can say Rav Yochanan's statement does not refer to Tsoros at all. It actually does refer to Keren, by the way. Why are we saying Keren? Let's look at this. The rabbis say that whether for Keren Tam, the animal does damage in the public domain or the private domain, you pay half payment damages. For Keren Muad, the rabbis say whether in the private domain or the public domain, you pay full damages from choice property. So the rule there is not divergent. Both in the public domain and in the private domain, you're responsible for Keren. And why do we relate this to Keren? Well, the animal kicked up a stone. So if you want to interpret it as Keren, then the rule is not divergent. Does that make sense? You owe for both.
Yeah.
So that is the law of the rabbis. Okay. Now we're just going to bring another inquiry quickly. Kev, you still with us, bud? Yeah. Okay. So the Gemara presents a new inquiry. So Rav Yehuda Nasiya and Rav Oshaya were sitting on the porch of Rav Yehuda Nasiya, and the following matter came up between them. One of them asked the following: if an animal swished its tail and thereby broke a utensil, what is the law? And the other one replied, shall the owner hold it by its tail constantly? And the person that's inquiring basically said, look, if so, say the same thing regarding Keren as well. Shall the animal's owner hold it by its horn constantly? So obviously the response from the other Rav was, listen, how can you call this a comparison? The act of Keren is abnormal for the animal, but the act of swishing the tail is normal for the animal. So what it's saying is, listen, you can't compare the two cases. With Keren, you are allowed to take the animal in the public domain because it's unusual for the animal to all of a sudden go crazy and attack another animal or person. So you don't have to sit there constantly vigilant holding the horse. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any concept of Keren Tam, of a tame animal. It would be full payment if the animal's natural default position was one of aggression. So he says, how can you compare it to a case of saying, oh, well, must you hold the tail constantly? So the Gemara asks, is it normal for an animal to swish its tail? So in other words, since it is normal, we learned it is normal because an animal, as it moves, it swishes its tail. Why did the rabbi bring it up? Because if it's a case of normal swishing, then it's not, it would seem a case of Kirin. What would it seem a case of? Of?
Rego.
Yes, Soros, Kevin, is only when an animal kicks something up. It's not a case of, the reason why it's not a case of Soros is because it's attached to the animal. We learned last time, Kevin's asking a good question, because it would seem like it's the force of the animal, the propulsion. But we learned in the case where an animal drops feces that's no longer part of the animal, or a zav, where a contaminated person knocks an object indirectly by throwing an object like a shoe to knock off another object. It doesn't contain contamination because it's not direct contact. A tail is attached to an animal, therefore can't be tzoros, so it's an act of keren. So therefore, the reason why we say it's not liable is keren is exempt in the public domain. It's normal for an animal to walk, and it's normal for an animal to swish its tail. So the rabbi said, but is it normal for an animal to do excessive swishing? So what it means is there ever a case where it's not considered normal for an animal to do? In other words, does it come a case where it's just abnormal? And the reality is it comes about, they're saying, no, listen, whether an animal swishes slightly or normal, animals swish its tail. There's no such thing as excessive swishing. Right. Now you're going to see, it's normal. So now you're going to see why this inquiry came up. So this other inquiry is Rav Einar inquired. If an animal swished its male organ, okay, because now that we're on the subject of swishing tails, we're on the subject of swishing male organs. So Rav Einar inquired, if an animal swished its male organ and thereby inflicted damage, what is the law? Do we say it's the same reasoning that applies in the case of keren? What do we mean? In the case of keren, it doesn't seem common. It's that an urge seizes it. An animal looks at another animal, and it has this urge where it just wants to smash something else with its horns. And we're saying here, there's no difference. An animal has a sexual urge, and then all of a sudden, it swishes its male organ. So we're saying, is it like a case of keren, where swishing a male organ is exactly where the animal gets an urge to smash with its horns? Or perhaps we say something different. We say, maybe we make the following distinction. In a case of keren, the animal's intent here is to inflict damage. Whereas in this case, it's not the animal's intent to inflict damage. So what we're saying in a nutshell is, on the one hand, an animal swishing of its male organ is unlike an act of rego. Why? Because an act of rego is common damage. And an animal swishing its male organ isn't common. It does so when the urge seizes it. So do we say we compare it to keren because it's not so common and it's an urge-based response? So in other words, in that case, it's a little bit common.
Okay.
But we say it's not completely uncommon that an animal gets a sexual gratification, etc. Animals have needs, they eat, they get sexually aroused, etc. And we're saying, on the other hand, the swishing of the male organ, unlike an act of keren, is done without intent to inflict injury. Remember, the two unusual aspects of keren. The fact of it is it's unusual damage, and the other unique features is its intent to kill or injure. So we're saying, listen, swishing of the male organ is not an intention to injure or kill. So in that case, it doesn't resemble keren at all. It only resembles keren in the fact that it gets an urge. And it's not that it's normal, but not common. Does that make sense? So what do we mean by normal, not common? If we look at shame, when an animal eats, it's completely normal that an animal would get the urge to eat. But it's not common in the sense that every time the animal makes a movement, it's naturally going to damage something. Because a big animal that's walking on things will naturally crush anything under it. or its body might knock something over. So every movement an animal makes has got that default position of commonly maybe damaging something within its path. Whereas an animal occasionally gets sexually aroused and occasionally eats. But it's not uncommon for an animal to get sexually aroused or eat. So therefore, it's not uncommon, but it's not normal. It's not every step behavior, so to speak. So we want to know how to classify it. If it's an act of regal, it's exempt in the public domain. Okay. And if it's an act of kered, where it's unusual damage, it's obligated in the public domain. Does that make sense? We are 19.2b.
Okay, so what you're saying is with the leg of the animal, you're not obligated. With the horns, you are.
Yes. So in other words, any category of regal where the animal moves in the public domain, you're exempt. Because in the case of regal and shane, it says when you send the animal forth in the field of another.
Yeah.
And when you use the pasuk in the field of another, this implies the public domain that's not owned by anybody specific, there is non-liability. Okay? And so this is something just to bear in mind. So exactly as Arthur said, and if you have a look, where is this? This is in Shemot chapter 22, verse 4, for those of you that are interested on the field of another. Okay. So the Gemara concludes, let this inquiry stand unresolved, which means we don't have an answer for this. We don't have an answer. All right, but it's an issue worth thinking about. Now, I just want to go to the next session. I don't know if you can see, guys, that we're flying past things. Yeah. But I think it's very productive sometimes to cover a lot of ground. We don't have to hammer an issue to pieces. All right. So the Gemara now discusses the next section of the Mishnah, which states, chickens are mu'ad to walk normally and break, etc. So if something was tied to its legs and it was breaking utensils, he pays half the damage. All right, I'm going to repeat this again. Animals are mu'ad, which is full payment from choice property to walk normally and break things. If it's a case of regal, an animal is responsible in the private domain. It's exempt in the public domain. But if something was tied to its legs and it was breaking utensils in the private domain, he pays half damages. Why? Because we can see that it's a case of tsoros. Something's tied to the chicken's legs and it knocks, maybe there's a can of tomato soup or whatever, and it knocks things and damages. So tsoros means that it's not part of the animal's physiology, meaning it's like kicking up a stone or pebble. So the Gemara wants to qualify this ruling. Rav Huna said the Mishnah ruled that one pays half damages only where the thing became attached to the chicken's leg by itself. But if a person tied it to the chicken's leg, then the tire is liable to pay full damages. Okay, obviously. Why? Because a person then created a hazard. So therefore, if he purposely tied it to the animal, he should be obligated for full payment damages. Guys, that's self-explanatory. It makes sense.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. So the Gemara analyzes Rav Huna's teaching and the Mishnah's ruling of half damages where the thing attached to the chicken's leg by itself. So it says here, in the case where it became attached by itself, who is liable? If you say that this means the owner of the attached thing, who does not own the chicken, must pay half the damages, how would this be so? Why? Because if he put away safely in his house and the chicken somehow found this object and it snagged to the chicken's leg, he's the victim of an unavoidable mishap and he shouldn't have to pay anything. But if he did not put it away safely and he's been negligent, he should have to pay full damages and not half damages.
Okay, so that's a difference.
Yeah.
No, I'm just working out the difference. No, I'm just understanding the difference. So if it's if it wasn't his fault at all, like it was the animal did it and whatever happened, he shouldn't pay anything. But if he didn't put it away and the animal did it without knowing it, he should pay full damage. Is that in a
That's exactly it. So we're not talking here about the owner of the chicken. We're saying, listen, maybe it was next door neighbors or there was a common area. And if you've got animals next door or lying around, etc., you must know that they're going to come into your place to forage or whatever. It's your obligation to put away any hazardous object.
Okay.
So we're saying here, listen, we're not talking about the person that owns the chicken. We're actually now talking about the person that created this obstruction around the animal's foot. Obviously, if the guy was an idiot and tied it around the chicken's foot and it caused damage, he's liable. He has to pay. And if he put away all his object and the chicken somehow snagged an object around its foot, he's not liable for anything. So why is there this half payment damage? So it's saying maybe does it mean rather that the owner of the chicken is liable to pay half damages? Okay? In other words, not the person that tied it around its leg. Why? Because it might be a case of tsoros, where the owner of the chickens, the animal caused tsoros by having this propulsion from that object around the chicken's leg. So we're saying, hang on a sec, but let's sort this issue out of the person that tied around the chicken's leg. All right, we've got 7 minutes left. I'm going to fly through this. So what's different about food damages where he doesn't have to pay? I'll tell you what. Now, what's this object that when it causes a problem? The object is, we did this in the daf of 6a. It says from Shmot chapter 21, verse 33, that it talks about a pit. Now, it says basically, you're not liable to pay full damages because it's written if a man opens a pit, if a man causes a pit. It doesn't say that if an ox causes a pit or a chicken. It can't be an animal that causes an obstruction because an animal is not aware, has an awareness of creating a public liability, right?
Yeah.
So what we're saying here is we're saying that this object was tied to the chicken's leg or the ox leg and somebody tripped over it. That's a classic case of ox. So we're saying that, listen, if a person tied it around, why is that person liable? Because the chicken moved to a different place. And we learn a rule with a boar that if you create a hole or a hazard at that place you're liable. But if the animal moved it around, why are you liable? Okay? And especially since the animal moved it to a new place, not the person. So the Torah says if a man opens a pit, but not if an ox opens a pit, thereby exempting him from paying anything. So why does the Mishnah rule half damages? So the Gemara now concedes and said, okay, we must say that the Mishnah rules half damages refers to where the chicken threw the attached thing into an article damaging it, which is a regular case of tsoros.
Okay.
So we're saying as follows. Basically, if the chicken's owner is responsible for any case of tsoros that the animal causes for half damages, fine. So then what happens to the person that actually tied it on the object, right?
Yeah.
So what the case is here, and when the statement of Rav Huna was said, it was said in general and not as a qualification of this particular mission as follows. So what's the law if someone tripped over and was injured by an ownerless thing that was attached to a chicken's leg? Rav Huna said if it became attached by itself, one is free from liability. Why? Because the animal's owner never created the hazard. Everything, not the animal's owner, sorry, the object's owner, where the chicken tied around that object. He put everything away in his house. The chicken somehow found it and got snagged. Then the animal's owner is not responsible. Sorry, Kabb, I can hear my own voice again. Now it's fine. So we're saying that if the animal attached that article by itself, the owner of the tied thing is not responsible. But if a person tied it to the chicken's leg, he's liable to pay for the damage. So the Gemara asks, on what basis is the tie liable? Because we thought that when a person creates a bore in that particular location, number one, you're liable. Now all of a sudden the chicken's gone to a different domain. Somebody's tripped over this article the chicken dragged over, and now the person could turn around and say, but I never tied it to the chicken's leg in your property. I tied it to the chicken's leg in my property. So then we learned that Gemara called the common characteristic. What's that common characteristic? The Gemara answers, Rav Huna bar Manoach said on the basis of the thing being his pit that is rolled about by the feet of men and the feet of animals. I don't know if you remember that common characteristic. Guys, we learned it a few weeks ago. So that common characteristic is that we're saying that a common characteristic is the pit means it's stationary and it can damage from that exact position. But we combine that with a person's ox or a person's property, that if his ox did damage, he's responsible for his property. So we use the common characteristic according to Rav that says that even if a person never created the damage at that point, but he owns the article, just like one's ox owns the article and it damaged, no matter where the ox is in the public domain, you're responsible. So to hear that object, the minute you pick up an object and tie it to a chicken, you've claimed, it says in Bava Kamma, the minute you've acquired it by touching it and tying it to the animal, you've acquired responsibility where it's your object. So based on the fact that it's your object, it's like an ox damaging in the public domain for carrying. So it's your object. And you mix that with the pit. So you can't turn around and say, I never created a hazard in that location, because if you mix ox with pit, ox is showing that even though your ox you never intended your ox to do damage, you're still responsible for your objects that do damage, like a fire that you set in one place and it goes to a field of another. That's your responsibility. So the fact that you said you left it at this point doesn't matter. We learned in the sixth stuff that if it rolled about by the feet of men and that object changed position, you're still responsible. Because if you never created that hazard in the starting point, it doesn't matter if it moved. So that's what you call the common characteristic. Okay. So therefore, even according to Shmuel, who said, even an object that's ownerless, if you create a hazard, you're responsible. So either way, you're responsible. Okay? So 19b3, we don't know if also the animal that was a case of Tsoros, the owner of the chicken is responsible. So we're saying as follows. The animal is, if it's a stationary object that created an issue and you fell over it, the person that tied it on purpose to the chicken's leg or didn't put away his articles is responsible for full payment as a case of bor that rolled about by the feet of men or animals. But if the object was in midair flying around as the chicken was, that has nothing to do with the person that tied it to the object's leg. That's the chicken's owner responsibility under Tsoros. Does that make sense, guys? Yeah. All right.